All right, so in the wake of the January 6th insurrection, it was pretty clear to a lot of leftists that there's this ongoing tendency of the US government to exploit moments of crises when the American people are feeling unsure about a lot of things or unsafe, that they can use these moments of crises in order to expand their own powers, whether it be through the police or the surveillance state. And unfortunately, Joe Biden, post January 6th, if you want to call it that, is following in the same footsteps as some of his predecessors like George W. Bush, who pushed things like the Patriot Act, which was basically the most brazen violation of Americans' constitutional protections against unreasonable search and seizure. He passed things like the Patriot Act that were in brazen violation of our constitutional protected rights, and it seems like Joe Biden is moving us further and further and further towards this same tendency and direction, this time with cracking down on domestic extremism. And so let's go ahead and read this report that was put out about who he thinks and who his administration is going to be allowing these federal agencies to classify, surveil, and potentially arrest and imprison some of these extremists. So here's the standard that they say. Domestic violent extremists are U.S.-based actors who conduct or threaten activities that are dangerous to human life in violation of the criminal laws of the United States or any state. It's important that they said who conduct or threaten, okay? Because threaten can be a broad term that can be applied to many different things. So they continue. In violation of laws of the United States or any state, appearing to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population and influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, as per the definition of domestic terrorism in 18 U.S. Code 23315. Mere advocacy for political or social positions, political activism, use of strong rhetoric, or generalized philosophic embrace of violent tactics may not constitute violent extremism and may be constitutionally protected, while the majority of DVEs that fall in one threat category, some draw upon or are inspired by ideological themes found in other threat categories. So, important use of wording here. They say may be constitutional protected. May not constitute violent extremism. So they're using these words because they don't actually want to apply this to a very small specific subset of people who are actually engaging in violent behavior. So this is not something that is going to just apply to violent extremists who act on their ideologies, etc. It's going to be applied across the board because they clearly lay out here, well, yeah, you can give your opinions on these things and you still have freedom of speech, but it may be constitutionally protected. It may not be. It may not fall under the categorization of violent terrorism, and it may fall under that category. So they're using these generalized terms in order to basically come out and say that this is going to be applying to basically everybody who would fall under these categories. So they have racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists. That one's pretty self-explanatory. Animal rights / environmental violent extremists. Not sure why that's such a huge problem. Didn't know that there was a bunch of animal rights terrorists that were going around the United States, but abortion-related extremists. And interestingly here, they say DVEs with an ideological agenda in support of pro-life or pro-choice beliefs. How many pro-choice acts of terror have there been? I mean, pro-life extremists do bomb, for example, Planned Parenthoods and attack Planned Parenthood locations. What are pro-choice people doing in acts of terror? I've never heard of that. But anyways, they continue, and here are the more important ones. Anti-government / anti-authority violent extremists. So DVEs with ideological agendas derived from anti-government or anti-authority sentiment, including opposition to perceived economic, social, or racial hierarchies. Notice they say perceived economic, social, or racial hierarchies, as if it's not a fact that under our capitalist system that there are hierarchical systems in place, as if there isn't a history of racial oppression in the United States that has formed hierarchies, as if this is just perceived. Okay, so again, important about the wording that they're using there. Or perceived government overreach, negligence, or illegitimacy. So they have militia violent extremists, they have anarchist violent extremists, they say DVEs who oppose all forms of capitalism, corporate globalization, and governing institutions which are perceived as harmful to society. So again, perceived. So if you think that capitalism has detrimental effects to society, then you would fall under this category. So notice what they're doing here, okay? They're classifying a broad scope of people, anyone who is anti-authority, who is anti-government overreach, who is anti-capitalist, who is anti-globalist. All of these people would be generalized falling under this category as potentially being labeled as violent extremists. And notice, it's not just the people who are engaging in acts of violence, okay? Because as we read at the top there, it's people who could be just using strong rhetoric. It's people who could just be online, on Twitter, or anything, who are engaging in these types of rhetoric, anti-capitalist rhetoric, anti-establishment rhetoric, anything that falls outside the bounds of what they consider to be polite discourse or what they consider to be in line with their establishment views. Anything that could be critical of the government, the establishment, the status quo, our economic systems, our political institutions, could be classified as violent extremism. Okay, and that opens the door for things like this. So here's a PBS article that talks about it. They say the Biden administration says it will enhance its analysis of threats from domestic terrorists, including the sharing of intelligence within law enforcement agencies, and will work with tech companies to eliminate terrorist content online as part of a nationwide strategy to combat domestic terrorism. If you think that this means it will only apply to the most violent, crazy QAnon conspiracy theorists and not to you and your anarchist or socialist or communist friends, then you're being delusional, okay? They are going to apply this to a broad scope of people and use it as a justification, just like as we saw thanks to Edward Snowden with the NSA brazenly violating our constitutional rights. This is another example of this. This will be used to surveil, intimidate, coerce, maybe even as we've seen in the history of the FBI, try to rope people into terrorist activities or into terrorist plots. And it will be used to crack down on any dissent that is coming from an anti-capitalist, an anti-establishment, an anti-current government order criticism. So that's what they're doing right here. It's pretty clear. This is exactly what we were warning about when January 6th happened. We said, don't panic, because these are the types of laws that they are going to put in place. These are the types of broad scope strategies that they are going to give to our intelligence agencies in order to crack down on any dissent. So this is something that absolutely has to be opposed. It's absolutely ridiculous that they're continuing in this trajectory, but it's exactly what you would expect from somebody like Joe Biden, honestly. I mean, this is the guy who was fervently pushing the Patriot Act under George W. Bush, too. So it's really not that surprising, but still, nonetheless, needs to be opposed as vehemently as possible, because this is just complete government overreach. It's a crackdown on dissent, and it's not going to lead to anything good.